Flirt FM, Galway's alternative radio station.
You're listening to the Galway Gamer here on Flirt FM 101.3. My name is Owen Murphy and I am the Galway Gamer. And joining me on the line from Canada is Jason Kapalka, who was one of the founders at PopCap Games back in the day and is now the founder of Blue Wizard Digital. Has worked on a ton of games that there are very few times that I do an interview in the show that I can almost guarantee everybody listening has played at least one of these games. But this is one of those times. We're talking Bejeweled, Peggle, Astral Pop, Slay Away Camp, Friday the 13th, Killer Puzzle, and so many, many more. Jason, thank you very much for taking the time to come on the Galway Gamer today.
Thanks. Glad to be on.
Now, to start off, I'm a big gamer, always have been, but puzzle games have always absolutely boggled my mind as to how they're put together. So how exactly do you begin a level in a puzzle game? Do you start with the final goal and reverse engineer it into a puzzle, or how does it work?
Well, I mean, and one thing is that I guess I've worked on a lot of puzzle games, obviously from Bejeweled to Plants vs. Zombies and Peggle, and now, Slay Away Camp and Friday the 13th. But I think one thing that's been true is that the term puzzle game is really very broad, and it's sometimes misleading for the types of games that you're looking at there. I think there's two main types that tend to fall under that category. And the classic puzzle games are ones, where there's something that you have to solve, and there's really only one way or one main way to do it, and you sort of have to keep working at it until you solve it, like a maze or a crossword puzzle. And then there's a lot of games like things like Tetris, and then later on Bejeweled and other games where people call them puzzle games, but they're really not quite the same thing. They're not that cerebral. They're more kind of bubble wrap poppers. I think we joked about them. It's sort of a thing that you can do kind of without thinking too hard. Sometimes it takes reflexes, sometimes just sort of good luck. But it's very different. So a game playing Tetris, or Bejeweled is very different than trying to solve a logic puzzle. So I've kind of worked on both types, but they're pretty different in how you approach them.
And you mentioned there that you call them kind of bubble wrap versions. Would that be where PopCap got its name?
A little bit. I mean, I guess actually the real story for PopCap's name was that we originally had a kind of a temporary name, Sexy Action Cool, which after a while became kind of embarrassing because it wasn't really a very good name for a sort of a family puzzle game company. And so then we realized, we better change that. And honestly, we ended up with PopCap because we thought that the word pop was a good word to use for that sort of thing. And we basically started working through different ideas to see which URLs were available. And so if Pop Frog had been available, we probably would have been called Pop Frog. But it turned out that PopCap was the first URL I found that we could register for like $10.
Okay, cool. And moving from the likes of, say, Bejeweled and Peggle, which are in many ways on a single plate, on a single board, to the likes of Slay Away Camp, although it's on a single board, it is an isometric kind of puzzle. Is it difficult to transition from a flat background to that isometric puzzle style?
It's mostly cosmetic in that case, and some of the early prototypes for games like Slay Away Camp were actually done in a top-down grid, just because it was easier than dealing with 3D objects and so forth. So a game like Slay Away Camp, you could play it on a flat top-down, two-dimensional grid. The 3D really just adds kind of flavor to it. So often for games like that, we would prototype it and design it basically on a simple 2D grid, just because it's easier and cleaner. And when you get to the 3D part, then you have to worry about things like, making sure the camera angles work properly and it doesn't obscure stuff and it doesn't confuse you by, disorienting you and so forth. So even isometric version things like Slay Away Camp, at their heart, they're still, simple 2D puzzles, just sort of dressed up in 3D.
Okay, cool. Well, when you were working with PopCap Games, you were primarily doing, as you said, family-friendly kind of stuff. They were all very bright, very colourful, very kid-friendly. But then when you moved to Blue Brother Digital, it was more kind of horror comedy stuff. You've got Friday the 13th Killer Puzzle, which had all manner of decapitations and impalments. You have the likes of Slay Away Camp, which can also be gruesome in a kind of cute and cuddly, almost South Park way. How did you kind of balance out the cute and the gruesome here?
Well, in some ways, it was a reaction against spending a decade at PopCap doing cute family-friendly things, and I always like horror, and so in some ways, doing Blue Wizard was an opportunity to do kind of some more gruesome stuff that I couldn't have gotten away with at PopCap. But it wasn't. In some ways, it wasn't that different because we'd done Plants vs Zombies at PopCap, which was kind of in the same general direction of taking a somewhat kind of gruesome or morbid, kind of theme, and then trying to apply that to a fairly casual puzzle or strategy kind of game. So in some ways, it's not that different. It's a little more over the top. Slay Away Camp and Friday the 13th are definitely a little more violent than Plants vs Zombies. But even Plants vs Zombies at the time, people had thought it might be, with zombies, it was a little too gruesome for kids and regular families. Although, as it turned out, of course, kids really liked Plants vs Zombies, so that was not really a problem.
And was it just the horror fan inside you that wanted to make that jump then, or?
Yeah, there wasn't really necessarily a compelling financial reason. There's more. We'd been prototyping some games, and we'd come up with a kind of a sliding block puzzle game that I thought was fairly interesting, but the main problem with those kinds of sliding block games like Sokoban and similar is that they're kind of very dry and cerebral and kind of boring. Mm-hmm. No matter how challenging they are, they're still a little bit, tedious. So the thought for Slay Away Camp was to see if you could take that kind of logic puzzle game and make it not boring by trying to dress it up with all these kind of crazy things. Basically, like, can you make a sliding block puzzle game interesting by making sure that it's super violent and super bloody? And once we started doing that, then the theme of moving to the slasher film kind of model seemed like the most extreme version you could do of that. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely a conscious attempt to make a boring puzzle game into something incredibly gruesome and over the top.
And Derek Mears supplied the voiceovers then for Slay Away Camp. He's best known for, Jason Voorhees in the reboot of Friday the 13th. Was that the first step towards securing a license for a Friday the 13th video game?
It was interesting. It was related, but it wasn't directly. So it was actually for Slay Away Camp. A different voice actor, Mark Meir, had been doing some of the other voices for Slay Away Camp, and it happened that he's best known for doing Commander Shepard in Mass Effect. Mm-hmm. But it happened that he was friends with Derek Mears, and so we were introduced to him, and we just kind of thought it'd be funny to cast him as Jessica, the final girl in Slay Away Camp, and he had a good sense of humor about that. Mm-hmm. There was no real direct connection to Friday the 13th there. And later on, the Friday the 13th rights holders approached us about doing, kind of a version of a mobile version of the game. But I don't think there's no direct connection to Derek Mears there. It's just a weird coincidence.
Okay, cool. And you mentioned there Derek Mears and Mark Mears, who was Commander Shepard in Mass Effect games. Are they related, those two lads?
They're not related. There's different spelling. There's
I see. Okay.
Derek Mears and then Mark Meir. It is kind of it made for some confusion in the credits though, because it does sound like they're brothers or something. And they do know each other pretty well, so they kind of hang out together sometimes too.
With Derek Mears then supplying the voice of Jessica and playing the final girl, and they all being very comedic, was it difficult to get him Well, to get him into a voice acting role like that, considering he would be best known for a mute role like Jason Voorhees.
Well, that's why it was kind of more of a sort of a joke rather than a serious amount of stuff. Mark Meir actually did a lot more kind of voiceovers on Slayaway Camp of various screaming teenagers and so forth. So Derek Mears was kind of more of a joke inclusion just because it was funny. Although ironically, once we did start doing the Friday the 13th game, I actually had dinner with Derek and sort of basically grilled him a little bit on. He became sort of our unofficial Jason Voorhees consultant in terms of what to consider when doing Jason in our game. And I think the thing that he'd said that sort of was most relevant for that game was that he says, okay, you couldn't really ever make fun of Jason. You could have funny things happen and you could make fun of other characters or situations, but Jason himself he's like Darth Vader. He's like this character who has to be he's so sinister and so evil and ominous that you can't really dress him up in a tutu or put him in a pink outfit or make fun of him in that fashion. He has to be kind of taken seriously, even if the stuff around him is a bit comedic. So we did take that to heart in Friday the 13th there, and that obviously is kind of a silly game. Our version is it's not meant to be really scary because you're playing on a mobile phone. But we did try to take Jason seriously. So he's meant to be kind of threatening and ominous, and so there's some gags and jokes in there, but they're not at Jason's expense.
Pretty amazing that you actually had Jason Voorhees to fall back on there, though. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting to hear him talk about. He's actually he's on Swamp Thing now, and it was actually quite interesting to hear him talk about it. In that, some of the earlier Friday the 13th films, there was not. The guys who were playing Jason, they weren't really being called on to do a lot of acting. They're mostly just, stuntmen and stuff who were supposed to stand there. But in Derek's case, he definitely put a lot of work into the actual characterization of Jason, even though, of course, he doesn't speak. As people know now, he's really good at that kind of nonverbal kind of acting. It was really interesting to get his feedback on that.
I actually rewatched the 2009 Friday the 13th just a handful of weeks ago by coincidence there, and he is quite terrifying in that. He's much faster than classic Jason. He's really, really scary. Is he an intimidating guy in real life? Like the dude, 6'5"?
He's really tall, yeah. No, he's a really nice guy. He's not threatening at all. And I guess I think it does depend a bit, I think, on the roles, and that I think because I guess he's naturally, fairly, he's tall and thin, which is, I think for those kinds of roles with costumes is ideal because that way, you can put on a lot of extra stuff. Whereas if someone is really heavy set to begin with, then, it's hard to, layer them in a bunch of latex and stuff without kind of them sort of starting to look like the Michelin Man. So I think he's very tall, but he's quite naturally kind of lean rather than sort of this hulking figure.
Well, the fans of Friday the 13th, the hardcore fans, the big horror fans who have been into it since way back in the day, how do they take the game, considering it is a comedic spin?
How do they take the game?
Do they do they find the comedy in it, or do they think it's a little disrespectful to what's a more serious franchise?
We were concerned about that originally, and we thought that there's some of the fans of Friday the 13th are pretty serious and hardcore about it, and we were worried that they might think we were doing wrong by the franchise. But in fact, I think everyone really enjoyed it. I think they kind of understood that we were making fun of some stuff about it, but it was coming from a place of knowledge and appreciation for the franchise. It's the sort of thing you see on things like South Park or The Simpsons if they're making fun of something, but you can tell that the people who are writing the jokes at least were very knowledgeable about it and kind of cared about it. So so when we were making jokes about them, a lot of the mythology of the Friday the 13th films, like with Jason's mother, sort of appears in the game as a floating head that's your sort of tutorial, kind of guide. And that's obviously kind of silly, but it's definitely kind of part of the actual mythology of the whole series, and and I think people kind of appreciated that we were sticking to the kind of core of the movies and trying to kind of be having a few jokes with it, but not kind of just mangling it.
And when we talk about horror movies appearing in video games, we see the likes of, say, Dead by Daylight over the last couple of years, which has a bunch of, DLC add-ons, which let you play the likes of Evil Dead, they let you play Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street, all of these other characters, even Silent Hill now as well, so you can play Pyramid Head. Would you like to do killer puzzles for other horror franchises like that, like Halloween, Child's Play, other killer puzzle games?
Well, it's been mentioned a few times. I mean, some of it is the license, legal things are fairly significant. For Slayway Camp, we definitely did do an awful lot of downloadable and extra content of different killers who were, I'll say that they were, they're kind of, vaguely, veiled satirical versions of lots of different famous horror movie figures. But yeah, I'm not too sure that I'd want to kind of do yet another horror puzzle game at this point. We're kind of, that might have been enough. Doing 2 games like that might have satisfied my need to do, gory puzzle games for a while. Excellent.
Well, just to wrap up then, you've spent most of your career developing for the likes of the mobile market through the likes of Bejeweled and Peggle and the Friday the 13th games and so on. How does the mobile market stack up against the home console market for these kind of games?
Well, actually, I mean, I've actually worked on just about every different platform. Yeah, originally PopCap was doing games on the web, and then we were doing a lot of games as downloadables for PC back, before Steam was even around. Mm-hmm. And then we've done mobile, of course, and we continue to do some web games, and we have some console stuff, Switch and Sony and PlayStation. So I don't know. Yeah, I've worked on just about most different platforms, and so they're all kind of, they all have their own challenges and so forth. I do kind of the advantage of mobile is that it can be sort of faster and easier to do things than console, just because you have to go through a lot more hoops and so forth to get games out on console. Mobile, on the other hand, you have the problem of it's easy to get lost in the crowd because there's so many mobile games coming out every day that and there's not really, very few mobile gamers do things like read reviews or go to websites for previews and all that sort of thing. So mm-hmm. It can be challenging to have a mobile game stand out, whereas on console, at least, you tend to you get a little bit more attention just because there's fewer games coming out all the time. But yeah, I mean, they all have their own their benefits and drawbacks. You certainly have kind of a more hardcore audience on console, so it's kind of nice to get players who are a little more dedicated. But mobile, again, it's fun to get people who are just there's a larger audience in many ways because there's just a billion, several billion people with cell phones, so you can definitely reach a large crowd.
And how can people keep in touch with you, Jason, then, and how can they get their hands on the likes of Friday the 13th Killer Puzzle and Slayway Camp?
Well, the easiest way probably is to check our website currently, which is bluewizard.com. And that'll have updates on all our stuff that we're doing. And yeah, you can, and as I mentioned, you can definitely get Friday the 13th on a bunch of different platforms now and coming soon on PlayStation. And Slayway Camp is also available on I think quite a few different platforms itself, mobile and Switch and consoles. So yeah, I mean, and of course, if you want to find PopCap games, those are still kicking around. I don't have too much to do with that anymore, but I hope people are still enjoying them.
Jason Kapalka, thank you very much for taking the time to come on the Go Away Gamer today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
And for me too. Thank you.
101.3 Flirt FM.